So the first thing that we've got to do is sort of acknowledge that parenting a kid with ADHD is a completely different experience. And what do I mean by that? So if we think about being a parent or even having a medical condition, generally speaking, the medical condition requires treatment. But the treatment of the medical condition is over here, and the parenting is over here. So if I have a kid who has asthma, for example, they get diagnosed with asthma. Kind of sucks that they have asthma, right? Of course. But we've got treatment. You start giving them their inhalers twice a day. And at the end of the day, their condition is treated and you can sort of live a regular life. If your kid has, for example, GI problems or gets an upset stomach easily, that's something that you just kind of like treat and then you're sort of done. The challenge is that parenting a kid with ADHD is not just like a diagnosis that you can treat and it kind of like the problem goes away. You can't really just manage ADHD and parent a kid normally. It turns out that parenting a kid with ADHD is a completely different experience because these are kids that sort of don't listen when other kids do. These are kids that always forget where their stuff is when other kids are able to remember. These are kids that will run into social difficulties and will blow out the candles at a different kid's birthday party because they can't control their impulses. And so then your kid doesn't get invited to the birthday party again. And then you're trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do about this? So parenting a kid with ADHD can be incredibly challenging. And this is where, generally speaking, we think about parenting as affecting our kid. And what do I mean by that? That means that we sort of know as parents that how I parent my kid will determine how my kid grows up, right? If I'm a good parent, I will raise a healthy and successful child. And if I'm a bad parent, I'll cause my kids problems. So if we sort of think about it fundamentally, the relationship between parenting and the person that you parent is kind of one way. We think about our parenting style as affecting how our kids grow up. The interesting thing about ADHD research is it shows that a child with ADHD actually shapes the way that we parent. And that most of the problems that we run into in parenting a child with ADHD are actually because of the way that the ADHD shapes our behavior. And if you're a parent with a child with ADHD, you'll sort of understand this because you want to be a good parent, but man, it's just so frustrating sometimes because you have to tell the kid 15 times to put on their shoes. You have to remind the kid 15 times to put their toys away. And so it can be incredibly, incredibly frustrating. And as you lose patience, as they don't pay attention, so you have to raise your voice, right? They don't listen unless you yell. And so as all of these things happen, we start to feel frustrated, we start to feel guilty, and we know that there's something going on here that we're not doing a great job at. So the key thing to remember is that generally speaking, we think about parenting as a one-way relationship with how it affects our child. But what we know is that actually the behavior of a child will actually shape our parenting as well. And it's important to remember that this is not just true of parents with kids with ADHD. So if your child has a clinical diagnosis of ADHD, all of this stuff kind of applies. But we sort of know in general that the attention span of children is changing. As technology advances, as technology invades more and more parts of our life, all of our kids are moving one step closer to ADHD. So this is something that we've really found is very relevant to basically all kids because of the influence of technology. So next up, what we're going to actually do is look at some of the features of a child with ADHD and see how that actually affects parenting. So let's start with a couple of core features of ADHD. So a child with ADHD tends to have disordered attention. And remember, what disordered attention means is that sometimes if you tell them to do something, they're not able to hold attention, so they can't hold their attention. And the other thing that they actually struggle with is sometimes they hold their attention too much. Once they get into something, it's very hard to dislodge them. And this is a good example of what we see with technology, where all kids, once they get their hands on a screen, it's very, very hard to get them to put it away, right? So you can't get them to change their attention. What are some other features? So we know that by virtue of the impulsivity and sort of distractibility of ADHD, what we sort of end up with is disorganization. So kids with ADHD tend to be more disorganized. And the third thing that we tend to see with kids with ADHD is because of, once again, this impulsivity, what we can also get is difficulties with social function. And this is also due to things like emotional dysregulation. So we know that a child with ADHD has a more impulsive mind when it comes to emotion. They're more vulnerable to getting angry or irritable, which can cause all kinds of problems in terms of defiance or difficulties in social relationships. So let's look at how these three things will actually affect your parenting. So when you have a kid who has disordered attention, when their mind is sort of stuck in a particular way, like they're thinking about, they're playing with their Legos and you sort of call them, you say, hey, it's going to be time to leave, go ahead and get ready to go, put your shoes on. And if they're stuck playing with their Legos, they're not going to pay attention. And so then you tell them again and they kind of don't pay attention, you tell them a third time, hey, you need to get dressed, it's time to get dressed. So what happens over time is we see something called passive noncompliance. And what passive noncompliance means is that they don't listen to what you tell them to do. The thing, though, is that when they don't listen to what you tell them to do, they're not trying to be defiant. They're not sort of saying, screw you, Mom, I'm not going to go, or screw you, Dad. It's passive noncompliance. It's literally a problem with their attention. Their brain is wired in such a way where they don't actually hear your words. Or in some part of their brain, they may be picking up your words, but the words don't break through their kind of attentional focus. And what this ends up doing, so when you have a kid who doesn't listen, and you sort of get this passive noncompliance, you as a parent get frustrated, right? Because you've told them 3 times and they're not listening. And then what you do is raise your voice. Because you as a parent will eventually figure out that if I raise my voice, it will actually break through their attentional block. And so then what you do is yell at your kid. Now, some of the reason you're yelling at your kid may be because of your frustration, but some of it is almost your brain adapting to figure out, okay, what does it take to get my kid to listen? What I have to end up doing is yelling, and if I yell loud enough, then they will actually listen. So the 4th time you're a little bit frustrated, you say, hey, it's time to put on your shoes and get ready, and then your kid gets startled. They look up and they're like, oh, okay, fine. So you've broken through their attention, they get up, they put their shoes on. And so over time, what happens is you learn that raising your voice is actually the most effective way to get your kid to listen. The problem is that if you do this time and time and time again, this actually negatively impacts their self-esteem. Because what is your child's experience of this? I'm playing with my Legos, playing with my Legos, playing with my... Oh no, Mom or Dad is yelling again. I screwed up. I can see that Mom or Dad is angry. I can see they're frustrated. So this sort of ends up negatively impacting their self-esteem. And this is where we've got to sort of be a little bit careful, because we can see that the reason you're raising your voice is actually because of the passive noncompliance. So we can see that the ADHD itself is actually shaping the parental behavior. And this is doubly tricky because when you raise your voice, and you can sort of tell that yelling at your kid on a routine basis is a bad idea, this in turn makes you feel guilty. And what we've actually seen is that children with ADHD exacerbate symptoms of depression in their parents. When there's a child with ADHD in the household, what we sort of see is that it creates more depressive symptoms and more feelings of guilt in the parent themselves. So we can see that there's actually this very two-way relationship between parent and child when it comes to ADHD. So that's disordered attention. Let's take a look at disorganization as well. So as a child with ADHD is going to have disordered attention, what that sort of ends up with is a lack of organization. So frequently the kid will forget things like assignments, and they'll even forget tasks that you sort of tell them to do. So you tell them to clean their room, you tell them to clean their room, you say, hey, don't forget your homework, don't forget your homework. Or you'll work really hard and make sure they do their homework, but they'll forget to put it in their backpack before they go to school. So this in turn is also going to lead to frustration on the part of the parent. And as you get more frustrated, what you're going to sort of do is you may sort of find yourself falling into yelling more and essentially trying to compensate for your child's disorganization. So sometimes you'll yell. The other thing that you'll sort of end up doing is you now bear the burden of organizing your child's life. And so now you've got an additional thing to worry about. So if you had a neurotypical child, you have work, you have bills to pay, you've got to pick up groceries and stuff like that, and you can sort of rely on your kid to take care of some of the stuff that's their responsibility. But if a child has ADHD, their disorganization is going to end up being your burden. And so parents fundamentally have to do more for their kids with ADHD. The third thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is emotional dysregulation. So remember that in the brain of someone who has ADHD, their limbic system, their emotional circuitry, is much more likely to get out of control and isn't really suppressible by their frontal lobes. So kids with ADHD are more prone towards anger, irritability, and sometimes we actually do see purposeful defiance. So if you yell at your kid, maybe your kid will start yelling back. This also creates problems in places like playgrounds and in social situations where kids are quick to anger. And if they're quick to anger and they sort of speak out of turn, right? So if your child sort of says something nasty to you because first of all, they're impulsive, and secondly, they get upset very easily, we see things like defiance, we see things like temper tantrums, we see things like meltdowns. And what does this do to you as a parent? All of this stuff increases your stress. And there's actually studies that have been done that show that a parent's stress level, if you have a child with ADHD, is actually higher than being the parent of a neurotypical child. Because dealing with this emotional dysregulation is very, very stressful. And what this can also do is lead to things like punishment. Because your child is more prone to be defiant, more prone to talk back. And so you as a parent are more likely to punish that child. You're going to lose your own temper because they're throwing temper tantrum, they're being defiant, they're not listening to what they should be doing. You're getting more stressed out. As you get more stressed out, you're more likely to react, and then you're more likely to actually punish your kid. And so it turns out that the parenting style is actually influenced by the ADHD itself. The worse the ADHD is, the more the parent becomes reactive, frustrated, raises their voice. And the other really challenging thing is that when you have a parent who's frustrated at the end of their patience and raising their voice, it actually exacerbates the ADHD. The kid's attention becomes, as the child becomes more stressed out, as the child gets yelled at more, becomes punished more, their ADHD actually gets worse. What we create is a vicious cycle where the child's ADHD is frustrating the parent, and the parent's frustration is worsening the ADHD, which in turn means that the parent has to punish them more and yell more. And this is sort of a vicious cycle that just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And when we say that parenting a child with ADHD is not as simple as treating a diagnosis, this is exactly what we're talking about. So the good news is that there's actually a lot that you can do about it. And as researchers dug more and more into the relationship of parenting and ADHD, they discovered a couple of really important things. So the first is that there are a few different features of parenting. One sort of axis of parenting that researchers looked into is essentially the warmth or coldness axis. So what we sort of have is some parents that are warm in their parenting style and some parents that are a little bit more hands-off or cooler. So I don't know if you guys sort of, if this sort of resonates with you, but I certainly had one parent who's very, very warm and one parent who's a little bit more discipline-oriented. The other thing that we sort of see in parenting styles is that there's an involved parenting style and there's sort of a hands-off parenting style. And so what we sort of see is that when we combine these different attributes of parenting, we end up with different parenting styles, and each of these particular parenting styles influences ADHD. So when we have a warm parent who's involved in their kid's life, this is sort of the supportive and structured parent. So these are parents that, for example, will pick their kids up, drop them off, be kind of involved in their life, talk to their teachers, talk to the parents of their friends. They're kind of involved in their kid's life, but they're involved in a way that's a little bit more warm and supportive. So when you pick up your kid from school, you'll ask them, how was your day? What are you struggling with? They'll sort of be like warm and supportive, but also kind of involved. And what we sort of see is that this is the parenting style that actually leads to the best outcomes. So when parents are supportive and structured, what we'll kind of see is that the symptoms of ADHD actually improve. And this is a moment where we sort of have to toss out a disclaimer where all of these parenting styles are not actually equal. I know that we live in a society where we want to say that, okay, is one parent, are all parents basically the same? And do all parents do a good job? And this is where, I kind of hate to break it to you, but the answer is no. Some parents adopt a style that actually leads to better outcomes for their children. And some parents are actually better parents than other parents. Not all parents are equal. And the whole point of this is that we can explain to you what are the parenting styles that lead to the best outcomes. And once you understand this, hopefully you can shift your parenting style to be a little bit more positive. So the next quadrant that we're going to kind of look at is the parent who's involved but cold. And these parents are controlling. So if we think about parents that sort of micromanage their kids, or sort of the helicopter parents, these are parents that are kind of micromanaging every aspect of their kid's life. But these parents will have very high expectations of their kids, right? So they want their kids to play piano, they want their kids to get straight A's, and they sort of if the child is struggling and gets a B, the parent doesn't ask the question, okay, why are you getting a B? What's going on? Is there some way I can help you? What the parent will do in this kind of situation is B's are unacceptable. You absolutely need to get an A, and no more video games and no more seeing friends until you get your A. So the parents who are involved and cold tend to look like controlling parents. They tend to have high expectations, and this will sort of lead to potentially a small increase in ADHD. The next parent that we have is the cool parent. And so the cool parent is one who's very warm, but kind of hands-off. And I don't know if you all had this, but when I was growing up, I had some kids who had cool parents. And when I was 12 years old, I had a friend who had a super cool parent that would let their kid watch rated R movies. This is the parent who is fun to be around because they didn't really discipline anything. They let you stay up as late as you want to, you can eat whatever you want to, you can watch whatever movies you want to, you can watch even movies that have a little bit of nudity in them as a 13-year-old boy. And these are the cool parents, right? They're kind of hands-off, but they're not really harsh or anything. In fact, quite the opposite. You can do no wrong in this parent's eyes. You can stay up as late as you want to. It's no big deal. There won't be kind of harsh punishments. And so the cool parent, and this there are a lot of reasons why we end up being the cool parents. Sometimes we end up being the cool parents because we're not disciplined ourselves. Sometimes we really, really want our kids to like us. And if we want our kids to like us, we sort of won't punish them. We won't set limits on them because that'll upset our kids. So what we sort of see with the cool parent who's hands-off is that we sort of see a slight worsening of ADHD. And then we sort of end up in the fourth quadrant, which is the parent who's hands-off and the parent who's a little bit cold. We essentially have the absent parent. So this is a parent who isn't really involved in their child's life. They're kind of hands-off, sort of like the cool parent is, but they're not even warm. They're not even supportive. This is the sort of parent that feels like they kind of don't care about their kids. So the absent parent actually leads to a lot of worsening symptoms of ADHD. So these are parents that don't bother to be involved and don't even bother to be emotionally supportive. So if their child struggles in school, if they're having interpersonal conflict, this is the kind of parent that won't really try to support them. They may even kind of punish them or be like, that's life, or you just got to learn how to manage it yourself, but then won't actually be involved with their child's life to sort of help them figure out how to do things. And so what we sort of end up seeing is that depending on your parenting style, you will sort of influence your child's ADHD. So each of these quadrants actually has a technical term too. So if you read books on ADHD, or if you look at scientific papers on ADHD, what you'll see is these terms. The parent who is warm and involved is called authoritative. The parent who is cold and involved is called authoritarian. So these are kind of like dictators. The parent who's hands-off and warm is called permissive. And the clinical term for the absent parent is actually neglectful. And you'll see some of this in some of the papers on attachment theory and things like that. If you guys have looked at those parts of Dr. K's guide, especially in the anxiety module, we'll sort of see neglectful parents. So it turns out that ADHD in kids tends to induce an authoritarian parenting style. As the kid becomes more disordered in their attention, as they become more impulsive, what that sort of causes the parent to do is raise their voice, yell. And when we're raising our voice and yelling, we sort of become less empathic. It's hard for us to be warm and yell at the same time. So what they tend to do is induce that authoritarian parenting style. The more authoritarian we become, the harsher we are with our kids, and the more we sort of exacerbate the ADHD. So the cool thing is that an authoritative parenting style actually lowers the levels of impulsivity and can improve attention. When parents are warm, patient, and structured, we essentially put guardrails or protectors on our child with ADHD. And once they have that kind of support, we can focus their attention in the right direction. The challenge with things like a permissive parenting style or a hands-off parenting style, or something that's overly controlling or overly involved, is that we actually infantilize our child with ADHD. If we're parents that are very, very warm or very, very controlling, what we essentially do is we don't provide guardrails, we drive the car ourselves. And as we take too much responsibility for our kids, we end up infantilizing them so that they never learn the skills that they need to learn. So just to kind of summarize, it turns out that unfortunately, having a child with ADHD is super challenging as a parent. From the get-go, ADHD is the kind of diagnosis that cannot simply be treated. It's not the kind of thing where you take your kid to the doctor's office, they get their therapy, they come home, and everything is fixed. You can't just start them on a medication and sort of fix everything involving your kid's ADHD. ADHD is one of these diagnoses that profoundly affects the parent-child relationship. The key thing to remember here is that when we normally think about parenting children, we think about our parenting as shaping our child, right? Depending on what kind of parent I am, I will raise a particular kind of child. The tricky thing about ADHD is that ADHD raises a particular kind of parent. The behaviors of the child themselves will shape our behavior as a parent. Can even do things like increase stress and exacerbate symptoms of depression within the parent. There are certain core features of ADHD like inattentiveness or disordered attention, disorganization or emotional dysregulation that will actually affect us as parents. In order to get my child's attention, I have to raise my voice. I have to yell at them. That's the only thing that seems to work. In order to supplement my child's disorganization, I have to bear that organizational burden myself. So not only do I need to think about what groceries to buy, what time to get to school, but I also have to remember what are all my child's assignments? When is this project due? When do I need to get them to study? So not only am I living my own life, but I'm bearing the organizational burden of my child. And the third thing that we struggle with is the emotional dysregulation of the child. And this does all kinds of things, like creates additional social burdens for me as a parent. Because now what I have to do is apologize to this other kid's parent for the behavior of my child. Now when I go to sleep at night, I'm wondering, will my child get invited in the future to birthday parties? And I also have to deal firsthand with the emotional dysregulation of my child. My child throws more temper tantrums. They have more meltdowns, which in turn stress me out and cause me to lose patience. And the problem here is that as my child's ADHD manifests in life, I react to it. And the problem here is that as my parenting gets altered, this actually worsens the ADHD that my child experiences. It creates a vicious cycle where ADHD impacts my parenting, and my parenting worsens the ADHD. And so a lot of parents of children with ADHD feel like they're spinning out of control. They just don't know how to get a handle on things. And we've explored with y'all some of these different parenting styles and research into sort of what is the right way to parent your kid. Unfortunately, we can sort of say, okay, you should be authoritative but not authoritarian. You should be structured and emotionally supportive, and you shouldn't yell at your kid. But we haven't really dug into how the hell do you actually do that? So next up, we're going to go into a lot of detail and share several techniques with you about how to sort of shift towards a healthy parenting style, which will support your child with ADHD.